Holy Spirit, be our teacher. Amen. Well, Messy Church is young. The oldest one in the Portsmouth area is still only 12 years old. Well, I've shown you that being messy, being incomplete, being under construction is all just part of the deal of being Christian. So I think there ought to be some space for trying new things and just finding what works. Did you know somebody reputedly said, never be afraid to try new things. Remember, it was amateurs who built the Ark. It was professionals who built the Titanic. And this vein of somewhat cynical wisdom continues about life in general, but specifically another one comes from people writing about the trick of learning to fly. And what they say is this: you start with a full bag of luck and an empty bag of experience. And the trick is to fill the bag of experience without totally emptying the bag of luck. They've also got this nice comment: it's quite helpful to keep the number of takeoffs and landings the same. Those in management, I think, also comment in quite a related fashion. Good judgment comes from experience. Unfortunately, experience always comes from bad judgment. Well, in the first talk, I explored how Messy Church was showing the way. Now, in what senses is it also still finding the way? Now, I don't mean by that there is only one way, no there isn't, to do Messy Church. I think you've heard me declare the values can and should lead to a variety of expressions. Today's talk just contains some hints, partly from the wider church and partly from some musings on the learning curve that I think Messy Church still is on. So here's the first one to come to. Yesterday I aired with you that Messy Church shows the way about church being more than just public worship. It springs from our values, but also from the way that a Messy Church gathering quite characteristically includes some distinct stages and very often then uses different locations to express those stages. I'd like now to, if you like, chain what is your experience to some learning from the wisdom of the ages. I think we can learn from other people who were big on discipleship and on having different locations to pursue different aspects of that discipleship and its multifaceted nature. Now, in this case, it's learning from the monks and the nuns. Stay with me. I've been a theological student. I've been a teacher in other colleges. I've been a curate, that's a kind of junior vicar, and I've also been a vicar. And curiously, in all of those stories, I've seen the development of buildings. I'm also a member of a new monastic community known as the Northumbria Community. Now, across all of those variety of experiences, I think I begin to see some sort of pattern. In the monastic tradition in particular, both in its writings, but also in its architecture, I think I want to suggest to you there may be 7 spaces that do different spiritual work. Let me just give you their headlines, simply alphabetically A to Z. First, we meet cell. Now that is where the individual meets both God and themselves, and it is a very open question, which is more scary? Now it happens through seclusion, through prayer, through slow reading, and sheer silence. It is one of the sharpest places of discipleship. Chapel then is the place dedicated to worship together. Now, I mean the sort of worship that customarily would be led from the front. It operates in known patterns. It can include singing, opening up scripture, and sometimes it will include communion. Next comes what I'd call chapter. It's so called because customarily a chapter from either the rule of that monastic order or a chapter from scripture has been read. But what characteristically happens there in the light of those words, that is where community decisions are made. Therefore, it's very interesting. Very often chapter houses are either round or actually they are octagonal. Next comes cloister. Cloister is those sheltered corridors that link up the other places. And yet cloister has its own special gifts. In addition to delightful conversations and planned meetings, cloister is also the place, I suggest to you, of surprising meetings, probably encountering the very person in community you least want to meet. Just pray for that person as you're thinking of them now. Garden, then, is actually the place of productive work. Garden feeds the community, only if it's tended. Garden and its underlying ethic of work, in the tradition, is a recipe against idleness. It is a provider of healthy exercise, and it is a balance against too much mental work. Refectory, then, is the beneficiary of garden. Food hits the table, and it feeds the community. And then the community benefits society through hospitality. Food is central to building a community. It is core to being human. Food accompanies all sensible ways to do mission. And then last, scriptorium. For those of you who know your Latin, it suggests writing. And that's about making accessible what God has already shown us. It's not primarily study, it is passing on wisdom for further fresh communities. It's the kind of work, of its own kind, that enables other work. The work of praying, of deciding and discipling. It enables all of those to advance. Now it may be, already you're thinking, wow, Messy Church just does a number of these. Yes, it does. But now that we are aware of this rich, diverse, yet deeply rooted way of seeing and thinking, my chief sadness is actually that a distortion has arisen. Let me put it in this way. I believe we have over-invested in chapel. Instead of being just one of 7 spaces, it occupies the predominant place, almost eclipsing some of the others. Think how much our buildings cost in terms of money and of time. Think what our dedicated and sometimes ordained leaders have to spend their time and their energy upon. Then scriptorium reduces to the preacher's sermon, which we know is a blunt educational device. It is barely a transformative device. Sometimes we've reinvented it a bit as a Bible study group, but among consumerist Christians, the historic passing on of knowledge to others quite often is missed. It's just for our benefit. Chapter is then narrowed down to our official decision-making bodies, and I'm sad to say their reputation for Christian behaviour is not very high. How many people actually think that the local church council is an intrinsic part of being church, not just a necessary evil or a device to control church business? Let's come to personal spirituality. Well, it is urged, but frankly it's not very much audited. Cell, which customarily happens outside the church chapel building, but places for private prayer in buildings are very possible, and you see that most clearly in cathedrals. And yet the time that most Christians actually spend in the cell of private prayer and being encountered by God both by Scripture and the writings of Christians down the ages, frankly, all the research says that time is thin. Other features, I suggest you have fared even worse. Refectory may not happen at all, or it's limited to that dreadful instant coffee, which is mistakenly supposed to reach the parts the others cannot reach. Interestingly, I think in the last few decades it is making some sort of comeback. So often a reordering of a church building has included kitchens and toilets. Because taking food and hospitality is serious and important. Now, we may have some cloisters, the spaces between various church rooms and the walkways around our buildings. But my fear really is they're not actually celebrated and recognized as such, because so often in churches the quality of our community is shallow, in-depth encounters that cloisters are about may actually be avoided. What about the world of work through garden? Well, too often, frankly, the world of work has simply fallen off the church agenda. Church attendance has been relegated to a sort of leisure pursuit. Garden is now just lawns, flowers, and graves in the churchyard. The world of work simply happens somewhere else. As a result, church understood as gathered totally dominates the sense that church is also what is dispersed. Doing chapel is professionally dominated, and a passive laity ensues. There is little confidence in passing on spiritual knowledge. Our decision-making is often fractious and inward-looking. Too many of us, frankly, are pew fillers, not becoming Christ-like. Hospitality is artificial at best and absent at worst, and the difference it makes to the rest of life is minimal. And I promise you, doing chapel better by itself will not redress that balance. Now then, the interesting thing in Messy Church, I suggest to you, you are halfway there already. But do remember that the 7 sacred spaces are the consequence of following Jesus. They are, in that sense, vocational locations. They cannot actually be imposed without losing the life that comes from their voluntary adoption. For the same reason, they can't be a structural fix for the ills of an individual group. The 7 spaces are neither a kind of brain transplant for a dysfunctional church or a fertility treatment for a menopausal one, much less a nose job for an ugly one. But Messy Church values do lead, I suggest to you, to a diverse set of stages, which is very encouraging. Think about this. Maybe it goes something like this. Maybe it begins in prayer and planning and practicalities. Have you ever thought that your team meeting might actually be chapter? And then you will exercise hospitality. Out of that, you explore creativity. Out of all of those things then comes the celebration of the whole of life, not just the celebration section. With the result, with further hospitality and family and food, hopefully people are better equipped to engage with life and for Christ. But here's something for you to do for the next 10 minutes or so. What connections do you see between the 7 spaces and your Messy Church? Find the person next to you. Group of 3 is allowed. Don't go bigger than that, because not so many people will get the time to talk. So 10 minutes, over to you. Let's explore a further question together. I suggest to you this may be a question that probably all of you will face. Could it be true that Messy churches have something like a natural unit size? That is, they could be too small to work at all, or they could be too big to really work well. See, it's a bit like that with humans. Below a certain weight, in relation to age and health, even viability is seriously threatened. And over a certain body mass index, not only physical performance suffers, but health can seriously deteriorate. Has anybody really thought we might have some anorexic and some too fat churches? Now, I'm not saying that there is one size for messy churches. I would think that it depends on at least 4 factors which will interact with one another. There is the size of the team, the amount of time they have available, what the venue will simply physically allow, and also what suits the local context. All of those matter. But just consider a few facts from our statistics. The messy churches that we have researched all lay a good claim to being fully fresh expressions of church. None of them were halfway houses to, you know what I mean, real church. Now, they do range in size, but taking their average attendance, and average attendance, they will have peaks and they will have troughs according to the time of year and things none of us have been able to work out why it changes. But here's the stats. Over 19 of them are larger than 100, with 2, and it's in brackets because they're included in that 19. And then there's 45 that are 99 to 70, 73, 69 to 51, 78, 50 to 40, 68, 39 to 30, 34 of them 29 to 20, and under 20, 14. The stats show us that 66% of them are in this range, 30 to 70. Maybe that is something like normal, natural unit range or size. Of course, that's why in our work we found the average is 52. Now, of course, there are some very big ones and there are some very small ones, and they may be absolutely right for their context. But statistically, they are not typical. Now, the big question, to which we don't really know the answer: what should you do when the typical size for your context is reached? Now, I think we also know from our stats that this question connects to what the attendance patterns tell us. What we do is we track the average attendance for at least 3 years of every example that we've been followed. Some are so young, they've only got 2 years of attendance, so you can't see what the pattern is. So they need to have at least 3 years to begin to see a pattern. With the messy churches, this then is what we have seen. About 30% of them continue over time to get bigger. That's the left-hand end of the little bar chart there. And 21% of them, right-hand end of the chart, have grown but now actually have begun to shrink in size. What you need to notice in the middle is half of them, 49%, are on a plateau. Have they reached their natural unit size? Question. What I think cannot be right to think is that once you've reached a plateau, this marks the ceiling of what God intends for your village, town, estate, or suburb. Because however great it is that you've got between 30 and 70 people, that leaves hundreds, if not thousands of people outside the scope of what God might want through Messy Church for your area. You see, in all forms of organic life, horticultural, animal, and human, the response to natural unit size over time is reproduction. Don't necessarily keep trying to add to what is. Where is the space to pray, to plan, to work for what does not yet exist? That might give greater roles to some of your other team members who are capable of doing another one. It might be a way to some of your teenagers would get a bigger challenge to which they would respond. There might be other days, there might be other times, other venues to try. Now, I know in some villages that's not true. There is only one venue. And we've also seen some evidence that some people choose to attend more than one messy church. You found the same. And now, if that is just consumerist-free childcare, I'm not so impressed. But if it might be in some cases a spiritual hunger, well, that's good. Or if in some cases it might be a desire to receive at one messy church, but actually to give at another, well, that would be a very different story. So the point, I think, is quite simply made from the stats. Here's what I'd like you to work on, and again, 10, 12 minutes. I wonder how you might know whether your messy church has reached its unit size. If that were to be the case, what actually would be your options? Over to you. Discipleship. In one sense, I'm slightly embarrassed to include this section at all because there was so much which was really helpful and profound brought out in the conversation yesterday. Let me just underscore perhaps a few things, and I may introduce some things too from our data about what is currently happening in discipleship, which is the backdrop, of course, to what you might continue to do. One of the helpful things, I think, comes in Paul Moore's book, unpacking there are at least three kinds of learning. So bottom left, the formal, which is rather school-like, but also the informal, which is much more apprentice-like, and sheer socialization, which classically happens in families. Now, it may be immediately obvious to you that Messy Church builds very positively on the second and the third of those two, because its community and its participation models ways of being and learning and changing. And it's a good question. Has the first one, the formal, been overemphasized in other forms of church? There is at least a live conversation to be had about that. And I know yesterday we unpacked in the conference all that's being learned around the world about how discipleship and Messy Church do intersect. Now, of course, you are not alone in finding the way with discipleship. At least you know you are seeking answers. Part of the backdrop is some parts of the inherited church don't even seem to be asking the question. So please don't let anyone back you into a corner that this is an especial Messy Church problem. But at the same time, I think there is some evidence that we Messy Church are still finding our way about this. Our research asked a number of questions to all kinds of fresh expressions of church about how they were growing in depth as young churches. And it's a topic in the wider church. I don't know if you know this book by Alison Morgan. I particularly like the subtitle of the book, The Plural of Disciple is Church. The developing maturity and of your Messy Church and the discipling of your members, I suggest to you, are actually two halves of the one apple. But I'd like to share with you some data from the over 300 Messy Churches that we have researched in relation to where it comes in a sort of table of 12 other of the more common kinds of fresh expression of church. And one of those measures is what's called 3 self-identity. And that measures the extent to which a young church is beginning to take responsibility for its own ongoing life. Now, in terms of taking steps towards becoming self-financing, that means covering your costs and maybe in addition contributing to the needs of others. The Messy Churches actually score above average. 61% are taking some steps down that road. But in modesty, in Messy Church, we should note, many of our leaders are voluntary lay people, so our staffing costs are much lower than in other parts of the church. And it may well be too that in the 37% of cases where we're meeting in church, we are actually there rent-free. And an accountant would say, what about full cost recovery? And people who don't speak accountant, well, never mind. What about becoming self-governing? Well, in that case, it means usually locally some sort of local leadership team, and again, you are doing pretty well. Slightly more than the self-financing, in this case 73%, but the average across the other 12 kinds of fresh expression in the church is 77%. Where perhaps you seem to be struggling more is what is called self-reproducing. Now that's a wide term. It covers the growth of indigenous leadership, the emergence maybe of ordinands, or starting yet another fresh expression of church. So it's quite a wide term. And only 32% of cases have actually begun to go down that road, and it'll be spread across those three ways the term can be used. Furthermore, and we should note this, 1 in 5 messy churches has made no progression down any of those three routes. Now that's a slightly higher proportion than we have found as the average in other kinds of fresh expression of church. So there's one measure connected to discipleship. Here's another. Now when it comes to celebrating the sacraments, the comparative picture, you might say, is a bit bleak. Messy churches are the least likely to offer either communions, only 12%, or 21% offering baptisms. The averages across other kinds of fresh expression of church is nearer 50%. Now I think there are a number of reasons for this. There are a number of messy churches that have at present a very short life history. This is something which develops over time. And you are mainly lay-led, and that may restrict your ability by the rules of your church to do those things actually you would like to do. Not only that, you are drawing more non-churched people, and that plays a part in how rapidly it's appropriate to begin to go down these roads. Now, in addition, we live in a background in which the wider church is not sufficiently friendly to child communion or to creative contextual liturgy for the non-churched or the non-book culture and their families. Let's come to a third measure. Let's come to various ways in which the discipleship of individuals or families might be pursued. Now, in doing our research, we tried to use some of the less adventurous ways that might be done and the more traditional ways in which that would be pursued, so we would capture the data. Now, with that caveat, I have to say we found that the messy churches are the least likely of all these kinds of fresh expression of church to run small groups or to put on courses. Around 20%, you will see on the screen, have done so. But that compares with 63% of the other kinds of fresh expression of church on average, running groups, and 42% who are putting on courses. Now, I immediately want to say some of these rather regulated forms of discipleship are not very messy-like. And it certainly would be the case they need to be positively messed in order to have some sort of chance. Messy churches, however, are more likely to work with people one-to-one. It rises to about 40%. Or to see people grow because you involve them in the team, a third of cases. But again, the averages in other kinds of fresh expressions of church are significantly higher, and nearly all other kinds are adopting these routes more. There is further to go. And finding the messy way to do it, not simply copying what other people are doing. What does one make of all this? I think I want to say too much is being laid at the door of your being only monthly. Why do I know that? Well, monthly is the characteristic gathering pattern of at least 5 other kinds of fresh expression of church, and they are scoring higher for all of these marks of discipleship. Not only that, but there is a growing sense that actually monthly attendance is becoming much more frequent in long-established churches. Okay, you're hearing the same. I suggest too, we also ought to pay more respect to the term celebration for the monthly gathering. In families, in sport, in festivals, in the Old Testament before the exile, celebrations are all much more spaced out than a weekly event. Now, my family, if we had a whole family celebration once a week, we'd all die. I think the issue is not that you are monthly, and celebration is a very interesting word that you've chosen, because it's something about, I think, longer rhythms. The issue is what occurs between them. And the emphasis on family and on home, on what is taken home from the celebration, and lesser gatherings, if that's the word I'm looking for, by the way, lesser, just different ways of gathering between the celebrations, I know is what some of you are already exploring. That seems to me appropriate. Now, interestingly, there's been some other research recently by a group called the Saltley Trust based in Birmingham, and they interviewed a number of existing current church members, and they found two headlines. One is that growing as a disciple is thought to be more your individual responsibility rather than the responsibility of your church to make you do. They also found learning from your own experience is more formative than belonging to a group or attending public worship. Two interesting findings. They also found bad habits and sheer laziness are the greatest hindrance to progress in discipleship. I would want to say, how interesting. The Desert Fathers taught us that a long time ago. Yes, there is chapel. Yes, there is refectory. Yes, there is cloister, and so on. What the Desert Fathers always said was, go sit in your cell, for your cell will teach you everything. And how interesting, few messy churches have a cell space in their meetings. And yet I heard only recently of one that has started to have a separate private prayer corner. Good work. And apparently it's being used. That's good. Well, there you are. A bit about discipleship from our stats and what some other people are thinking about discipleship. Let's pick up another hot potato. Perhaps you do have an issue over what a genuine, messy evangelism could look like. It follows, of course, from the value of being Christ-centered. If he is the center, what roads would helpfully lead there? Some of you may know Bob Jackson. Bob has been a writer for 20 years and more about church growth in England. I believe Bob would love to see Messy Church flourish and succeed. You may have noticed he wrote a chapter in Messy Church Theology, and he raises the question, will it fare better than the traditional Sunday school movement, which began in the 1790s, or the family service movement, which began in the 1970s? Both of them, he says, had great promise, but he wonders whether, in the end, did they deliver less than their promise? Here's one quote from his chapter that raises his doubts. I'll only put part of the quote on the screen. Many messy churches are reluctant to push a strong Christian message for fear of putting parents off. Sunday school was part of the Christendom framework of life, but messy church exists in a strong and secular post-Christendom culture. So in the 21st century world, in which the distinction between Christians and others is sharper and clearer than in the Christendom world we've left, unless messy church is about helping people to catch a genuine Christian faith, it is hard to see it having a deep and lasting impact either on individuals or on society as a whole. Let me add now what our research has shown about messy church present practice. we offered to all kinds of fresh expressions of church a variety of ways in which quite gentle evangelism could take place. We didn't include holding a rally, bringing in Billy Graham to your next meeting, street preaching, or even house-to-house visits. And again, seen one way, the picture for you is a bit stark. In 3 of the 6 categories we offered, messy church is the least evangelistic among all the more common types of fresh expression of church. You guys are the least likely to run some form of inquirer's course, even to engage with the surrounding community, or even, relatively speaking, in building relationships with others. Now, in 2 other categories, inviting people to tell their faith story or to attend worship, you're not bottom of the list, but you're only one above the bottom of the list. And you're also the most likely to do none of the 6 things. However, you are only halfway down the list for the one remaining category, inviting people to other events. That's what the data shows. Now, I think some factors do really mitigate what might sound like a big hole, and in a sense, I'm sorry to have to tell you all this. The first is that because messy churches do so well in drawing the non-churched, the journey to faith is going to take a lot longer. The cultural gap is wider and is going to take longer to cross. The path will be more uncertain. The path will be of many more small steps. All that, I think, is true. So I want to say other kinds of fresh expressions of church which draw more Christians should not throw stones. Equally, one has to say there are many traditional churches who simply have no non-church people and wouldn't recognize it, with watercress around it. And they do no active evangelism either. That's the backdrop. So clearly, there is some weakness here, but it is relative. Go back to the stats. Over building relationships, the bar is set very high by the other kinds of fresh expressions of church. The average is 81%. So your figure of 65 is only relatively weak. Actually, you're doing quite well. It's a similar story with inviting people to events and even inviting to worship, presumably saying, hey, would you fancy coming to our message church? Again, the scores are relative on those 3. Actually, you are doing quite well. The statistics suggest that the biggest gaps are twofold. One is that so few messy churches are trying or even finding their equivalent of what would a messy inquirer's thing look like. And on average, as it's shown there, 44% of the other kinds of fresh expression church are finding their way to do it. You must find yours. Similarly, around 52% of all the other kinds of fresh expression of church are encouraging people to tell their faith story. In messy church, it's only 23%. And yet, I'd want to say, turn that round. If a quarter of the messy churches are finding ways to do that, why cannot the rest of us learn from them? How are they doing it? And presumably in a messy way. Once again, I've been struck by some of the stories that I've come across in preparing to be with you. So I'm going back again, actually, as it so happens, to Harper Hay. On big celebrations like Christmas and Easter, and sometimes in a summer carnival, they ensure that part of what is communicated is the possibility of relationship with Jesus. Now, as you may remember from the Harper Hay story, they might do that in a way of talking about God as being safe and trustworthy, and how a relationship actually works out with him in life. Now, I think, interestingly, maybe characteristic, they have also found what I would call their gentle but passionate evangelist. Grace Forster is a woman known locally in the area for working with disadvantaged kids in danger of exclusion from school. So she's a woman in the area who has street cred. But she also has the gift and the bottle to ask people during a messy church meeting actually to put up their hand if they would like to explore a relationship with Jesus, and to come and tell her afterwards that they did that. And a few, frankly, are doing that. She then goes and visits them one-to-one in their home. And as a result, some of them are even saying, "Oh, can I now join the Messy Church team?" So this evangelistic and nurturing aspect of Messy Church is happening. Now, Grace knows if that grows, she will actually need a team of people who will go and visit people on a regular basis in their home, and maybe with those people, if it's appropriate, start some sort of small group with those people who are taking those further steps. Now, my guess is that the Messy Church community needs to hear this kind of story, and doubtless there will be others, in which good, messy, relational evangelism is going on. Well, another Messy Church, in this case in Blackheath, has run a weekend messy camp. Interestingly, another classical community time in which exploring faith, sharing faith stories happens more easily because you are spending time together. And they've used sometimes the messy life material. Now, the cost of doing such a weekend might put off some people, but if the sending church, or even the Messy Church as a whole, had a kind of anonymous assistance scheme, that might be able to break their problem. The same Messy Church has also worked with a messy munch, a barbecue put on by 5 Messy Church families, inviting more of the fringe families to come and join with them with that. And that was found particularly helpful in families where one partner is a believer and the other either isn't or had lots of questions. Ika Kennett Brown is here. Could you please give us a wave? Thank you very much. Great. And she can forgive me for unduly truncating her story, I hope, and tell you more ways that maybe they've tried. I'm sure that there are more stories out there. So again, it's over to you. Would you share with one another some steps in evangelism that maybe your Messy Church has tried, and maybe some lessons you would want to avoid? Or if frankly you're saying, hey, we're still in the starting blocks about this, what in terms of what you heard do you think might be possible where you are? Over to you. Last but not least, you are a young church. The Messy movement is young. I began by saying the one in Portsmouth, only 12 years old. And in our database, 76% of them are no more than 5 years old. The rest of the church has simply no comprehension of what that's like. Even the house churches of the 1970s are now 40 years old. They don't know where you are. Now, when you're young, it's a time of beginnings. It's a time of forming identity. It's a time of making discoveries. Life moves on quick. And there are plenty of stumbles along the way, even if you're not singing the first song this morning. So Paul says to Timothy, don't let anyone despise you because you are young. I'd want to say to you, be kind to yourselves, both about your youth and that you will get older. Now, to help perhaps put that into some theological context, you may or may not know there are 2 interlinked Christian views of time. And the bigger picture runs from eternity through creation, salvation, the now not yet kingdom, the return of Christ, the new heaven and the new earth. The posh word for that is teleological. And that means running to a purpose. Forgive us, we have a a maximum in our research department: why use one short word if 3 long ones will do? Having a yesterday and a today and a tomorrow is not an accident in the purposes of God, nor are forgiveness and purpose and hope. And young churches may well resonate with that sense of knowing your recent past and aiming for a future. But there is another view of time, one which we see reflected in the seasons. It's less linear, it's more cyclical. To everything there is a season. Messy churches, I suggest you need to be aware of both views. Your younger years will feel like a springtime in the church. Indeed, the whole movement feels like a springtime in the church. The growth in numbers, the growth in width, the growth in depth, the growth in reach is quite astonishing. But in your individual cases, a perpetual springtime is not what will happen. In some ways, spring will give way to summer, and summer may well give way to autumn and even winter. You will have endings, setbacks, disappointments, even tragedies. How interesting the Canadians began this morning saying, "There is both a falling and a rising." You may have to learn how to take a messy funeral. It might even be the death of a child. There will be seasons when the signs of God are prolific. And there will be times when it looks like God has gone on holiday and all you get is, "Please leave a message." We need to learn to live with both sets of time. You see, young and new churches face the danger of being so purposeful, so future-directed, that what actually happens is you might blow up. Older churches can be so wedded to churning out the same pattern as they did last year as actually they dry up. And then there's another dynamic. Because there is some sense in which messy churches have a tendency to serve stages of life which include children, principally junior and primary, you have some similarity to schools. What you have is, if you like, a higher rate of continual throughput. And all the time there are newcomers. But there may also be leavers too. And one of the dangers is to be so taken up with coping with the newcomers that the challenge to develop the old comers actually gets set aside. And that will mark, if you like, a plateau in the height or a baseline against the depth to which a young church can grow. Perhaps the team will be wise to spot both the newcomers and the old comers, and find ways to respond to both. This may be fanciful. You may even choose to develop an equivalent to having messy church alumni. I want to affirm to you what messy church already is. Together you have started something that's had an impact, both in the mission task of a post-Christendom world and the church seeking a post-Christendom self-understanding. I want to say thank you for showing both of those to us now. Now, it is then unsurprising to me that you are a young church still finding ways, and you must continue to explore what is not yet, but draw also on the wisdom of the past, and yet stretch beyond your current boundaries. All I can say to you is, you have my prayers and you have my heartfelt wishes as you do so.